Okay, Hotel family, my name is Brother Ray. Today is November the 3rd. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club. We meet here twice a month. Okay, sorry family. Got messed up with the camera now. Saturdays at 10:30 at night. We have Sister Empress Chi, Blog Talk Radio. You go into Blog Talk Radio, type in Sister Empress Chi, go down New Day Resurrection, and it'll set you up with all the steps. That's from Saturday, from 10:30 sometime. She goes all the way to 1 o'clock in the morning. And it gets hot. That's our family out in Philly. So there's a lot of information. Also, on Tuesdays at 5 o'clock on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, we have Mike Graves and the Community Cop family, another members of the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr. History Club. One of the hottest shows in the nation. That's important. So it's a whole lot of information coming down. And that's why we come here to keep these people's names in the mix, so they never be forgotten. Now, we're gonna, our keynote speaker for tonight is one of the founding members of the hottest show in the nation, Sister Keisha Forrester with Keisha, Tad, and Ashe. Thorough Black Talk. When she comes up, she can tell you a little bit more about the program. She's been a member of the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club, and she's been here giving her lectures. Family, if you want to witness or view the videos on the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr. History Club, you can YouTube Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club, and all the videos will come up. You can listen to the great Dr. Lewis, Mike Graves, Keisha's videos is on their Trustgram, and we're going to have some, we're going to be putting more videos on Big Shoot. Of course, some of them is, you know, they took them off. So, without further ado, I want everybody to give a great big hand to one of the co-hosts of Thorough Black Talk on Facebook. She's going to tell you a little more about her program, and her topic tonight is, what is it, Keisha?
Early African American
history
of New York
and the road to reparations. Family, without further ado, we're going to give a great big hand to our sister, Keisha F.
Thank you, Brother Ray. Normally I'm helping him out on the Zoom call while he's doing that. So, for those of you who are watching on Zoom, if you know, you should mute yourselves, right, until we get to question and answer part, and then in a few minutes or at the halftime mark, Ray can put in the Cash App for you guys to donate if you want to. Tonight's topic is early African Americans of New York and the path to reparations. First, about Thorough Black Talk. Yes, we're on every week, every Thursday, 8 to 10 p.m. We engage in history, current events, and politics as it relates to us. We keep it from a black perspective, an independent perspective, the way that Brother Ray has here with the William Mackey Jr. Study Group, because it's not only a study group, He's independent black media as well because he streams every other week, right? Every other week. And you can get the replays on YouTube and BitChute. So he is also a part of independent black media. And that's very important in this day and time that we tell our own stories from our own perspectives. Because if we don't, other people will do it for us. So we're going to get started. I have a lot of reading to do tonight, so we get out of the way of the view so everybody here can see it, and y'all on Zoom could see me and hear me, and everybody on Facebook, you can see and you can hear me as well. This is something that I started doing quite a few years ago, studying our history locally. It's because of my own family history, right? Every 2 years we have a family reunion, and it's usually held in a city where our ancestors migrated from or to, right? And one of the keys to the argument of reparations is that we don't understand the local history, how we can collect local dollars from our local government and fight on our own behalf, right? People can tell you about the great empires of Africa, right? Whether it be Sudan or Nubia or Egypt or Kemet, Mali, right? All of the great empires. But when you ask someone about their local history, they get a little fuzzy. Some people don't know their local history, right? So tonight we're going to learn a little bit about some New Yorkers. And all of the information that I'm sharing with you tonight came from the archives, whether it's the public library archives or land trusts, right? I have some video to show you about areas we settled here in Brooklyn that's now part of the land trust. Well, who's fighting for that area for us? Who's advocating on our behalf? Nobody is. Also from the historical society. Right? So this is nothing that I made up. You all can go to the library and get it yourself, right? Okay, good. So when I came across this picture, it just stood out to me. Like the pain in her eyes and her hands even. Let me see if I can expand so you can see her hands. But they're very distinctive, hard, and nobody knows who she is, right? But she was here in New York, and her name is Rosanna Vosburgh. Was most likely born into slavery in Albany on June 14, 1800. Let me see, I gotta stand this way. So if y'all catch my back on this side, I apologize, okay?
That's a good back.
Okay, and she would have gained her freedom at least by 1827, right? Because that's when slavery was done here in New York City in 1827.
Right.
I see Rajan here, you better behave today. In 1827, the year slavery ended in the state of New York. According to her gravestone in the Olcott family plot in Albany Rural Cemetery, Rosanna served for 63 years, a faithful colored servant of the family of Thomas W. Olcott. Now, 63 years this woman served. Could you be a descendant of hers? Could you have married a descendant of hers? Could a cousin of yours be a descendant of hers? We don't know. But I plan to get back into the archives to find out more. Judy Jackson, born between 1809 and 1812, was sold to a couple as a wedding gift at the age of 11. I mean, just look at her face. Just look who knows how long she served? We don't know. So when people say that you can't argue for reparations because you can't And there's actually museums here in New York, in Brooklyn. Like if you go to the Wyckoff Museum, right? Wyckoff Museum has a lot of information about African Americans who were brought here by the Dutch. Now this is where I got her information from, right? And I just want to read this real quick. Can everybody see that? Or if you can, then I'll read it. This article originally appeared in our February 2017 issue. The story the story of what was to become the United States of America typically features two main characters: the native peoples who had lived in these lands for centuries, and the Europeans who took those lands from them. But there is a third cast member in this drama, one whose role is best downplayed. I'm trying to roll this up so y'all can see it and I see it at the same time, so just bear with me. I want y'all to be able to read it along with me. Okay. Europeans and a third cast member in this drama, one whose role is at best downplayed and at worst ignored: Africans and their descendants. In 1613, just 4 years after Henry Hudson's crew sailed up the river that would bear his name, and 7 years before the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth, a mixed-race man named Juan Rodriguez, at least that's the way it's spelled, left Santo Domingo for the New World, set up shop in and around Manhattan Island, traded with the natives for a time, squabbled with the Dutch, who called him a black rascal. That's a badge of slavery too, isn't it? When someone calls you these names, right? Also, you should keep that in your lexicon in the fight for reparations. And then disappear from the public record as the first African to set foot in Hudson Valley. Now, I didn't say that, that's what the archive said. The first African to set foot in Hudson Valley. So if anybody has lineage in Hudson Valley, it's us, right? Not no Asian immigrant or any other immigrant for that matter. Us. That's in the public record. But now you have the Democratic Party trying to figure out how they can repair a damage done to immigrant families who illegally crossed over the border, giving them $450,000 minimum. But we can't have reparations. Now imagine, now here's a slave collar, right, that I found. It's the person who wore the slave collar belonging to a family here in New York, right? P.S. Glenn, that was the owner, okay? The exhibit begins with the slave neck collar, an engraved brass implement of ownership 4 inches thick and 3 pounds in weight. Now, could you imagine putting that on your neck? 4 inches thick, 3 pounds in weight. Meant for a slave named Harry who had ran away on June 3rd, 1805. The two businessmen from Kalahari, Montgomery County, I don't know if y'all know that, but that's here in New York, who had purchased Harry jointly, posted a $50 reward. So when people say that we have no slave legacy that we can immediately tie ourselves to, that's a lie. I want to also show you all how when some of these enslaved Africans were given their freedom, or what the Dutch called half freedom, because they really weren't totally free. In fact, if Dr. Lewis and myself were married, we would be able to petition for our freedom, but our children will remain enslaved, okay? And at that time, the Dutch was giving away property to newly freed Africans. Now, when I tell you what this property is, you have to ask yourself, who owns it today? Should it be us, or should it be the state? Here's a man, Manuel, they called him the Groot. They called him the Groot because he fought. They said that he was someone who they couldn't contain, that he was a big brute. So they say Groot, right? You have to think in Dutch terms, right? Got the Dutch speaking here. So tonight, like I said, I'm going to go through some of these people's life stories, and hopefully it'll give you an understanding of our legacy here in the state of New York, and in particular in Brooklyn. Okay? And I have some maps that I'm going to show you all in a couple of videos that I'm going to show you all as well. And I know if Harold was here, he'll be happy I came with the maps tonight, right? Because he said you can't study without a map, right? And earlier I said that I'm going to show you about the land trust and the preservation of these towns. Back then they were called towns that belonged to black people. In fact, you ever heard the saying, Sudan being the land of the blacks?
Yes.
Okay. Hold on to that thought as we go further. Okay. So again, there are 3 different periods we're going to go through, and here are some of the enslaved or newly emancipated folks that we're going to discuss tonight. We're going to do the Dutch colonial period from 1627 to 1664. Then the British colonial period, 1664 to 1783. The United States period, 1783 to 1814. About life stories. All of the subjects in these profiles were real people who appeared at least once in the public record. That is the legacy. They are in the public record. In documents like runaway notices, advertisements for slave sales, and legal papers. All through the period of slavery in New York, from 1620 to the 1820s, these records were nearly always written from a perspective of white men and white women who owned, traded, and made regulations for enslaved people. Only in 1790s do the first documents and the first memoirs of life in slavery authored by blacks in New York and black New Yorkers appear. For life stories, the records were reconsidered from the perspective of the black person being written about. They are not fictions. Y'all hear that? They are not fictions. Since no details were invented, they are not biographies, since they were so often focused on one single moment in a life. Instead, they use historical information to help us reimagine enslaved and free blacks at the center of their own stories. Life Stories aims to portray slavery not as an abstract system, but as an interaction of human beings. It tries to put a human face on the enslaved and on the enslaver. Of course, the actual faces of most of these people were never recorded. There are photographs of Sojourner Truth, the historic images of John Jay, Catherine Ferguson, John Russwurm, and Peter William Jr. But we do not know what the others look like. If historic portraits did not exist, the drawings that appear with profiles were based on some of the earliest available photographs of black people in the middle of the 19th century. They should further help readers especially children, understand that slavery and emancipation happened to real people, not fundamentally different from us. So, again, I said I'm going to start with this guy, Groot Manuel. Now, oftentimes, we don't discuss rebellion locally, right? Somebody can tell you about the Haitian Revolution. They can tell you about the revolution or attempted that of in South Carolina, right? Gabriel Prosser and everything else. But they can't tell you locally what was done. And if you look in the local libraries of just about every city in this country, you will see that we rebelled consistently And in fact, we use holidays that the Europeans practiced for times of rebellion as well. So we're going to go through some of that. Manuel was a sailor on a Spanish or Portuguese ship in the 1620s. West Africans sometimes worked on European ships, and they sometimes had European names like Manuel. One day, Manuel's ship was captured by the Dutch. These captors were a hazard of life at sea. Crew members were killed, abandoned, or forced to work on a new ship. Sometimes they were sold as slaves to plantations in the Caribbean or Brazil. Manuel and the other crewmen on his ship had a different fate. They were brought to Manhattan Island as slaves. The colony of New Amsterdam was only for 2 or 3 years old then. Just a small, struggling settlement at the tip of Manhattan. It was too small and struggling to please the Dutch West India Company, which wanted a busy and profitable trading site here. Before this could happen, Manhattan had to be cleared of trees, buildings had to be constructed, and roads cut. There were not enough white colonists to do all of this work, so Manuel and other Africans were brought to New Amsterdam. Manuel was given the common Dutch name, de Griep. I think that's how I'm supposed to pronounce it. That's what the lady in the museum told me. But anyway. And he was called Groot, which means big. Groot Manuel and other slaves were not allowed to leave the colony. They had backbreaking work, often chained together, sawing, hoeing, plowing, carrying, and building. One wall they helped build is gone now, but the location is remembered as Wall Street. The slaves were responsible for getting New Amsterdam on its feet. They helped defend the settlement against Indian raids too. Without them, it's hard to imagine how the colony would have survived. As hard as the slaves worked, they were sometimes given time off. One day in 1641, Groot Manuel and some of the others went to a tavern. A fight broke out, and a slave named Jan Primero was killed. The colony's leader decided to punish one person rather than lose several slaves. They picked Groot Manuel and sentenced him to hang by the noose around his neck. Maybe because he was so big. Whatever. But these people, these crackers are something else. The leaders tried another rope. That rope broke too. They gave up and let Groot Manuel live. The company knew how valuable the slaves were, and so did the slaves themselves. In 1644, Groot Manuel, several other longtime slaves petitioned the Dutch West India Company. They had the biggest lot of slaves in this region, in New York. From 1600s to the 1800s, they had the full lot. And then the next time I come here, I'll tell you exactly who those families were. And you pass their street names every day. The company knew how valuable the slaves were, and so did the slaves themselves. In 1644, Groot Manuel and several other long-time slaves petitioned the Dutch West India Company's director, William Keat, for their freedom. He granted it, saying that they had been promised freedom for a long time and could not take care of their families if they remained enslaved. He freed the men's wives as well. He gave the families plots of land north of town in an area that became known as Land of the Blacks. Land of the Blacks, the same as in Sudan. So when people say Africans weren't here, they didn't use their own names, they didn't use their own customs, you know for a fact that this is not correct. Keith did this partly to create a buffer zone to protect New Amsterdam from the English or Indian attack. The blacks were called free, but they were not as free as white people who lived in New Amsterdam. They had to pay a tax every year or donate some of their crops at the market and be ready to serve the colony again if they were needed. Maybe worst of all, their children remained slaves. Historians later call this half-freedom. However, the blacks were no longer enslaved. Nearly 20 years after he was stolen from his ship, Groot Manuel was a man who owned property and had some for his life later on. This guy, Groot Manuel, the property that he owned was what's now called Washington Square. How big is that property? How big is that site? Who owns it now?
Washington Square Park area?
Washington Square Park.
Big.
Who owns that site?
NYU.
We're going to find out.
Okay.
To prove that this man owned this lot of land, it's now in possession of the state. Who gave it to the state? Why that's not our land?
Our final story takes us back to a time when African Americans owned some of the choicest real estate in the New World.
Turn this.
December 1609. Henry Hudson, a British sea captain in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, is searching for a trading route to the Orient. At the gateway to North America, he stumbles upon a great island in a mighty natural harbor. The settlement of New Amsterdam gives the Dutch a toehold in North America. But much of the colonists' labor came from imported Africa. Those enslaved men and women cleared the land and laid the foundations of the urban community that would one day become New York City. Mark Mitchell, a collector from Fairfax, Virginia, has a 1667 document which he believes tells how some of those slaves fought for their freedom and won land some 200 years before the Civil War.
I remember going to the library when I was only 8 years old and getting hooked on history. When I first saw the land, it just sent chills throughout me. Early American document pertaining to a free person of color in what is now New York City was just extraordinary.
I too was familiar. I'm meeting with Mark Mitchell to learn more about his land deed.
For you right here on the table.
Okay, what is it?
This is a land deed, 1667. Signed in New York.
That's Group's land deed right there in the public record.
That's impressive. This might be a truly historic document. How did an African win freedom and land so early in American history? Where did you get this from?
All this from a dealer in New York.
I've seen some of these, but nothing as early as 1667. What can I find out?
I'd like to know precisely where this land was located. And I'd like to know what happened to it. And also, a bit about the status of the black community in early New Amsterdam.
Is there anything you can tell me that might aid in my investigation?
Well, frankly, I'm just interested in anything you can find out about this.
Okay, so I'm gonna go do what I can do. Get back.
Bluetooth mode.
All right, thanks so much. Richard's document was written in 1667 and signed by the British governor of New York. It says that a free African named Groot Manuel had been given land by the Dutch in 1644, some 23 years earlier. The document transfers the property to Manuel's widow, Christine, and it gives her full legal right to transfer the property to her children forever. The text establishes an African as a landowner in the 17th century. It could be historically priceless, but is it real?
So you see, when people say that we have no lineage here, we have no history here, so we can't get reparations here in New York, that's a lie. Because who ended up with his property? The state. Sister by the name of Dorothy Creo. Dorothy Creo was one of the first black women in New Amsterdam. We went through the first man. Here's one of the first black women in New Amsterdam. Our legacy is clear here. She was African. What did she say? She was African. Okay? So when people say, well, we came here after everybody else, that is a lie. Okay? And don't let nobody play that game with you either. But she came from the New World, from a new world where West Africans and Europeans have been trading for 2 centuries, and their cultures have mixed. She may have spoken Spanish or Portuguese, in addition to her African language. The word Creole was often applied to people from this mixed world. Dorothy and other African women were brought to the colony because the male slaves needed wives and the Dutch women needed help keeping house. In those days, keeping house meant more than what we call housework today. Family survival depended on the work of women: cooking, growing in the garden, preserving food, watching children, making warm clothes for winter, keeping the house and laundry clean, and taking care of people who were injured or sick. White women and black women may have all worked at these tasks, but female slaves almost surely did the hardest, riskiest, and dirtiest jobs. Dorothy married Paulo and Gola, the first Africans who came here under Dutch rule. Their last names or their surnames they were allowed to keep. And so oftentimes they use a surname as it related to whatever country or place that they came from. So they were allowed to do that under Dutch rule. And these names are also in the archives if you ever check them. One of the first male slaves brought to New Amsterdam. Paulo's last name and the most common surname among the slaves. It signaled that he had come from Angola on the southwestern African coast. One day in 1643, after she had been in the colony for several years, Dorothy went to the Dutch Reformed Church to serve as godmother for a black baby named Antonio. When the boy's parents died a short time later, Dorothy and Paulo adopted them. Later, Paulo died. Dorothy continued raising Antonio with her new husband. This is one of the first times when the public record shows New Amsterdam black people stepping in to take care of each other, though it was common, but it's also a part of the public record. When Antonio was still a baby, a Dutch sea captain named Jan de Vries came to New Amsterdam to help fight the Indians. Visiting sea captains were often given special treatment, and this may be why Dorothy and Paulo became the captain's slaves for a time. They were still owned by the Dutch West India Company, as they had been for more than 15 years. For Paulo and a group of other slaves, this was long enough. They decided to petition the company for their freedom. Surprisingly, as it may seem, they won. The company's director, William Keat, freed the men and their wives. Blacks, again, were often freed, but their children remained enslaved. They also had to pay a yearly tax. Ain't that something? Taxation without representation? And you got the Congressional Black Caucus today that say that they have to form a study to see if we can get reparations. But the newly illegal immigrants, that's what they call them, are now getting $450,000 minimum. But we have to wait on a study to see if we can get reparations. Yet we keep voting. Keith also gave the former slaves farms in the area north of town known as Land of the Blacks. So she too was in that area, okay? He may have wished to acknowledge their years of work, but he also wanted a buffer zone again, because when the English came, they needed somebody to block them off, or when the Indians came, they needed somebody to block them off. And so this Land of the Blacks was in the middle of all of that, and they can call them to serve in the military anytime that they felt like it. All right? Now this dude right here, Solomon Peters. Solomon Peters and his wife Maria belonged to the first generation of blacks born in Manhattan. Now there's the birth record. Some of the first blacks born in Manhattan. Not the Irish, not the Italians, not the Jews. Their fathers were both brought to New Amsterdam by the Dutch. They probably grew up speaking Dutch and maybe Portuguese, Spanish, or an African language that they learned at home. Their fathers were given the limited freedom called half-freedom, offered by the Dutch, but Solomon and Maria spent their childhood as slaves because that was the Dutch rule. When they were grown, some of these enslaved children sued the Dutch West India Company for their freedom and won. This may show how Solomon and Maria came to be free blacks during the British colonial period. They lived on a farm in the Land of the Blacks. Again, Mr. Solomon lived in this area, okay? A tract where the Dutch had given property to freed slaves. The free black settlement, the first New York, was located where Washington Square is today. At the time, it was considered well north of town because New York City was still small and concentrated around the tip of Manhattan. The black residents farmed, sold their produce, and managed to get by. Now, here's the trick. But they were not rich. It is not clear if somehow Solomon and Maria Peters had more money than their neighbors. But on November 30th, 1694, Solomon did something unusual. He wrote a will. He was probably middle-aged by then, but he noted that he was in perfect health. Solomon Peters gave directions for what would happen to his property when he died. His house and farm buildings, his land, and his household goods would go to Maria. If she died, these belongings would go to the couple's 4 daughters. He left his iron tools, his farming equipment, and his guns, swords, and pistols to his sons. In addition, he left 4 pounds to his oldest son and 18 shillings each to the remaining 3 boys. This will and the items mentioned provides a glimpse into Solomon and Maria's life and family, and into what properties they had accumulated after many years of hard work. The date of Solomon's death is not known. By 1716, Maria was a widow, and she was living in difficult times for free blacks. After the slaves revolted in 1712, the British passed harsh new laws to restrain free blacks. It was hard for them to find work, to make ends meet. Maria was probably quite old by then, and she decided to sell her farm. Free blacks did not have money to purchase property, so the buyer was a white man named Horn. All around her, other free black landowners were facing similar problems and selling their land to whites. By the late 1720s, there were no black families in the Land of the Blacks, and the place faded into history. So, not only did they have to pay a tax, we don't know how much that was, and how consistent it was. Then, whatever crops that they made, they had to give half of that to the Dutch West India Company and other groups, like the Vanderbilts, one of many. So now, when they wanted to find employment or to set up businesses outside of that, they weren't allowed to do that. And so they ended up selling off their property. Willingly or by force? I'll say by force. Hoogland's robbing. When New York was a British colony, there were many things that the enslaved blacks could do. They could not leave their master's house without a pass. They could not get together with 3 or more blacks. However, they could become Christians. So all of us in this room right now will be breaking the law, and still breaking the law in some instances. In fact, there was a law that encouraged this. In the early 1700s, robbing became one of many slaves who spent Wednesday and Friday afternoons in Elias No's house to learn about Christianity. They sat on benches in an attic room listening to No's sermons, prayed and sang hymns. Many of the slaves had just arrived from West Africa and now was French. No one spoke English, at least not well they did, but somehow they made it work. The slaves probably had several reasons for going. They may have found Christianity appealing. They may have trusted them, who treated them warmly, even though he was a slave owner himself. They may have used the cashier's book to learn how to read. Many slaves hoped that being baptized would bring them freedom. Some of us believe that now. Europeans argued about whether it should or should not, and never completely agreed, so slaves kept hoping. That's how it is now. You worship and you hope for a better day. You vote and you hope for a better day. It's crazy. Robin asked his owner, Adrian Hoogland, for permission to be baptized. Hoogland said no. Robin asked again after the new law said that a slave did not become free by converting to Christianity. He was willing to accept that becoming a Christian would not bring him his freedom. Hoogland still said no. On an April night in 1712, Adrian Hoogland was killed along with several other whites. A group of slaves had torched a building and then attacked the whites who came out to put the fire out. It was a carefully planned attack. The British response was quick. 70 suspected rebels were jailed, and some 40 were charged. Robin was the only one accused of killing his master. Because Robin had studied Christianity, some whites blamed now for encouraging the blacks to rebel. Now school almost had to close. Most of the 18 slaves who were convicted were hanged or burned at the stake. Robin's fate was more gruesome. He was hanged in chains to die slowly. A minister visited him before he died and urged him to confess. Robin refused. He admitted he knew about the conspiracy, but said he was innocent of his owner's death. The minister seems to believe him. Same thing happened today. The same thing happened today. Rainier Mars. On a spring night in 1712, after the moon set, 2 slaves set fire to a building on the property of Baker Peter Vandenborg. They then ran to a nearby orchard and joined other slaves who were waiting quietly in the darkness. There were more than 20 of them, and they were all holding guns, knives, or hatchets. But today, they tell you to turn your guns in, right? You should never be without a weapon. That's not our legacy. When neighbors noticed the fire and came running to put it out, the slaves attacked and killed 9 white people. The governor sent troops to capture the blacks thought to be involved. 6 slaves committed suicide rather than being taken. 39 others were charged with crimes. Mars was one of several blacks charged with killing Adrian Beekman. This was the first big uprising of slaves in New York. 1712 was, of course, noted in the public record, one of the biggest uprisings in this region. Most had only been in New York City for a year or 2. They were just beginning to understand what it meant to be a slave here. In West Africa, a slave could eventually become absorbed into his owner's family. When these Africans learned that in New York they would always be slaves, they started planning their rebellion. The trials began within days, and most were quick. Some people were tried, found guilty, and executed in a single day. Mars' owner, Jacob Rainier, testified at his trial. He may have spoken on in Mars' favor because Mars was found not guilty. The Attorney General had an old feud with Rainier and decided to try Mars again for killing Beekman. No double jeopardy applied to them, right? To him, rather. This is crazy. Mars was found not guilty at the second trial, too, but the Attorney General was not finished. He ordered a 3rd trial of Mars and charged him with a different murder. This time, Mars was found guilty and sentenced to hang. It was June 7, 1712. The royal governor Hunter stepped in. He thought the Attorney General was using Mars just to get back at his old enemy, Rainier. The governor issued a reprieve for Mars and wrote to England for an official pardon. Mars had to wait in jail until the pardon arrived in October. But then his case was finally settled. He was not hanged, and he was returned to Rainier as a slave. I'm going to show you something real quick because I know we're getting ready to come to the break. But I want you guys to see this. Again, our legacy is rich and thick here. I don't know if you've all seen this on PBS, but it's called The Woman in the Iron Coffin.
Oh, man, I went to that church. There's a church out in Queens.
Right.
I went there. I went out there and he shows that and I bought that documentary. Yes. Fantastic.
Subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button. Click the bell button and enjoy the latest uploads from our channel.
On Secrets of the Dead, human remains are found in Queens, New York. We're dealing with an African-American woman. She died over 150 years ago. Neglected history is revealed.
It's really important that we create this rich and diverse tapestry of 19th century African American life.
And the local community comes together.
Her life is a testament to our life.
And they said that they believe she died of smallpox. But over a 150-year-old, 50 years, found in Queens, New York. So don't let people tell you that we don't have lineage and legacy here in many different places. Richard Jarrett. On January 24, 1720, a boy named Richard Jarrett became an indentured servant to the widow Agnes May. Richard signed the indentured contract while his mother, a free black woman named Frances Jarrett, served as one of the witnesses. In those days, Both in America and in Europe, children did not spend their time learning how to read and write unless they were rich. They spent it working, whether they were white or free blacks. Very often, they worked as indentured servants, starting as young as 7 years old. This was not the same as being a slave. The work itself was not much different, but slavery was permanent. Servants were indentured to their employers for a fixed period of time, and then they were free. Richard's term was 14 years. In exchange, his employers provided food, clothing, and a place to live and learn some skills the servants could use later to find work. It could be a good bargain that worked for both sides. Sometimes servants remained very poor long after their contracts ended. His employer may have been poor herself, maybe too poor to buy a slave. Agnes May's husband, William, had died without writing a will. She may have needed Richard to help with the house, or whatever work she did to earn money. Without a man in the house, Richard had no way to learn a man's trade, and that he could practice when he was free. His mother would have recognized this, but if she did not have the resources to raise Richard herself, she had no choice. So a poor black woman in those times, had to indenture their children, right? Again, we read earlier where adults could buy their freedom, but their children remained enslaved to these companies or to these households. So could you imagine selling your grandchild because you couldn't eat? Some people still do that today. They sell their kids, right? Today, they still sell their kids. Is it willingly or is it forced? And is this a case for reparations? I say so. Jarrett was an old Dutch name and very common in the colony. Though the spelling of it could vary, some of the earliest blacks in Manhattan had been given the name when they arrived as slaves. If Richard was their descendant, he may have grown up hearing stories about his ancestors. He may have heard that the Dutch had given long-time slaves their freedom and farms in lands of the blacks, north of the village. The stories would have sounded strange and wonderful to Richard because his New York was bigger, busier, and it was British. The land of the blacks was mostly owned by white people now, and the lives of free black people had become much harder. After the 1712 revolt, just 8 years earlier, the British colony authorities were worried that the slaves would rebel again. They wanted the world in which all free people were white and all blacks were enslaved. They did not trust blacks because they could easily not control them. Among the strict new laws that were passed after the revolt, one made it very expensive for slaves to become free. This had the effect the British wanted. By the time Richard finished his period of service in 1734, there were very few free blacks in New York. So now, when we first started, you had the first arrival of African Americans. They would work for an indentured servitude, then be granted their freedom and given lots of land. One place we pointed out is Washington Square Park, the area known as Washington Square Park now, that they formed their own communities, right? But now things are starting to reverse. Because they had to pay those taxes, because they had to give half of their crops away, their freedom really wasn't worth anything because they were dead poor. So now they have to turn over their children again into enslavement. Not to the Dutch, but this time to the British. John Fortune, on the early 1720s, a free black man named John Fortune bought a slave woman named Myra and her son. Later, John and Myra were married. But John already thought of Maria as his wife, and Robin was probably his son. He and Myra also had a daughter named Elizabeth, and John may have purchased her as well. A free black man buying slaves would have been surprising at any time, but it was especially so after the slave revolt of 1712. The British had passed new laws that made it much harder for the free blacks to earn a living in New York. Many jobs were closed to them. Most could never earn the money to buy their enslaved families or friends. John Fortune was a cooper, a man who made wooden barrels. Just about everything was stored in wooden barrels then. Cider, flour, grain, salted meat and fish. Coopers made wash tubs too, and buckets and butter churns. The work took practice and skill. The wooden pieces had to be heated and bent, scooped out with a special knife, and then fitted together tightly so there were no leaks. A good cooper could stay busy and make good money. Somehow, even with the strict new laws controlling free blacks, John Fortune was able to save 40 pounds he needed to buy Myra and Robin. Even more surprising, he found a way to secure Myra's freedom. He did this even though the British did not want free blacks in New York. They had passed a new law that made it very expensive to free a slave. An owner needed to pay 200 pounds when a slave was freed, and then pay 20 pounds a year, every year, for each slave. Despite this, Myra Fortune was listed as a free black on September 2nd, 1723, when she and John signed an indentured contract for Elizabeth. The girl had turned 9 on the 1st of March and would serve a term of 9 years. John and Maria made a good contract for their child. The employer was a single woman named Elizabeth Sharpless, a well-off daughter of the town clerk of New York. Sharpless agreed to the usual requirements of the employers in indentured contracts. She would provide Elizabeth Fortune with food, clothing, and housing, and teach her art skills of housework, like how to keep house, right? So again, if she had to re-enslave her, or if she had to lease her again, she was already trained in keeping house, and we talked about that in the beginning, how important that was. But she would also make sure that Elizabeth learned to read English. At the end of the contract, she would give her one good new suit made of wool and linen over and above her usual clothes. For her part, Elizabeth Fortune promised to serve well and faithfully and not to marry before her term was complete. She moved into Elizabeth Sharpless' house the same day the contract was signed. So here you have a child growing up with his mother and father, and because of the financial state that they're in, or just because they were being pushed out of Land of the Blacks, or what's now known as Washington Square, lease their children out. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine having to lease out your children and grandchildren? And people tell us that we don't have a cause for reparations. Are you out of your mind? Are you out of your mind? On September 30th, 1734, a man named John McLean placed an ad in a New York City newspaper offering a young Negro woman for sale. McLean and the slave lived at the upper end of Beaver Street near the Royal Bowling Green. We pass that on the subway, don't we?
All the time.
Right? Bowling Green. Excuse me, so the next time you're on the subway and it passes that stop, remember your ancestors were there. He did not give his slave name. He said she was about 20 years old and could do all sorts of household work. McLean may have been exaggerating because he wanted a good price for a slave. In some households, slave women did not cook, but The ad said this woman could cook, roast it, or broil food pretty well. That probably included most dishes the family ate: potatoes, vegetables, roasted chicken or pork, stews made of beef or lamb. She was also called a good dairy woman. This meant she milked the cows and churned butter and made cheese. Bread making was her job as well. She made the dough, kneaded it, and shaped the loaves. She kept the fire at the right temperature so the bread would bake and not burn. In those days, cloth was made at home, and it took a long time. McLennan said this young woman was very good at carding and spinning. That meant she could comb and tangle wool or linen until all the strands were going in the same direction. Then she could take the fibers into the spinning wheel and spin them together into long threads. Later, a weaver would make the threads into cloth. This unnamed slave knew how to make soap for wood dishes, from wood ashes and fat. She was good at washing the family sheets, tablecloths, handkerchiefs, shirts, and underwear. If there was a baby in the family, she washed the diapers too. She did all of this by hand in big tubs of sudsy hot water. Sometimes she starched so they would be stiff and stay cleaner longer. She ironed almost everything. She had other good qualities too, according to McLennan's ad. She did not drink rum or smoke tobacco. She was strong and healthy. She had already had smallpox, so she would not come down with the dangerous disease again. McLennan wanted buyers to know that this was a mild and quiet person, someone who did many jobs well without a complaint. Of course, he had no way to know what this quiet woman was thinking. What time we break, Ray? I just don't want to go over. How much time I got?
We could break at 9.
Okay. Burke's Sarah, a story of 1741. On March 18, 1741, the fort at the tip of Manhattan caught fire in the high winds and burned down. Without the rain that came later, nearby buildings would have burned as well. In succeeding weeks, a house and a warehouse caught fire. New York was a town of wooden buildings, and people were used to fire. They could not help but wonder, though, why so many of all of a sudden? Was someone setting fires on purpose? Then someone found hot coals under a haystack, just waiting to catch. A woman heard 2 slaves talking and laughing about setting fires. Someone saw a black man racing away from a burning building. The slaves are setting fires. There have been slave revolts in other colonies recently, and white people have been murdered there. The New York authorities held an investigation, and a servant girl named Mary Burton began to tell the stories of the great slave conspiracy to burn down the town and kill all the white men. 70 blacks and 20 whites were arrested and charged. They were pressed to confess and blame others. After the first few were hanged, more people confessed, possibly hoping to escape punishment for 3 months. It seemed that every black person in New York might be called to testify. The trials went on and on. Sarah was the only black woman charged in the 1741 plot. She was owned by a widow named Miss Burke. Early in the trials, a witness said she saw Sarah at the big meeting at Houston's Tavern, where the plot was said to have been planned. He said that she was the only woman there, and that she and another slave were given the job of burning down the meal market, the waterfront building where the slaves were hired out by their owners for daily work. When her time came to testify, Sarah said she knew nothing about the plot. The judge said there was evidence against her, and only one way she could save her life was to tell what had happened. By then, 2 slaves had been executed, along with a white tavern keeper, John Houston, and his wife. Sarah knew the judge was serious, and she began to talk. She said she had been at the meeting at Houston's. She named other slaves who had been there too. She said big knives were sharpened during the meeting. Then she changed some of her testimony. She said some of the blacks she named had left from the meeting before the plot was discussed and were not guilty. Later, Daniel Horstman, one of the judges, wrote a book about the case. He said Sarah was more trouble than any of the other witnesses. He said that when she began to testify, she threw herself into the most violent agitation and foaming at the mouth. He called her one of the oddest animals amongst the black Confederates and created a creature of an outrageous spirit. After her testimony, Sarah went back to jail. 14 more people were executed while she waited a month to learn if she would live or die. Then she was brought to court again. Because she had helped build the case against people thought to be involved in the plot, the judge said she was one of 43 blacks who would be pardoned and sent into slavery in Hispaniola, the island where the countries of Haiti and Dominican Republic are today. No one knows what happened to her after that. Historians are still not sure if the big slave plot was real or if the authorities panicked by the fires overreacted. Some things were certain though. Buildings did burn down. New York slaves were enraged and vengeful. Whites were nervous and suspicious, and punishment was quick and bloody. All in all, 30 black people and 4 whites were executed. More than 70 other people were deported to labor in the West Indies, where the work was much harder and death rates were higher. Slaves dreaded being sent there. So now when you have this ADOS argument, you know, they talk about, well, people from the Caribbean can't claim their lineage here. They need to fight for reparations where they are, which is true. But this document tells you that they were swapped over and over again. So if Ray Ray was born here and he became unruly or plotted a rebellion and he was captured, they would send him to Haiti, Jamaica, wherever. So does that mean that Ray Ray's descendants give up their legacy? Absolutely not. So that argument holds no water. I think we're about to take a break now. Right, we're at 9 o'clock.
Okay. Well, we still got 10 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
But, you know.
Okay, thanks. Ward's Will, a story of 1741. On March 18, 1741, the fort at the tip of Manhattan caught fire in high winds and burned down. Without the rain that came later, nearby buildings would have burned as well. In succeeding weeks, a house and a warehouse caught fire. New York was a town of wooden buildings, and people were used to fire. They cannot help but wonder, though, why so many all of a sudden. Again, in the beginning, I told y'all when the Europeans or when the Dutch had holidays, in particular, one holiday called the Pinkster holiday. I don't know if you ever heard of Pinkster. You heard of the Pinkster holiday? Actually, they hold a reenactment at the White Museum every May. It's a couple of weeks after Easter, but it's during the month of May. Anyway, this Pinkster holiday, they would allow their enslaved Africans to have the week off. And they would engage in their own rituals, their own dances from their homeland, cook various foods from their own homeland, and one big major distraction was dancing. I know you all heard this term, dance a jig. That's where it comes
Yes,
from the Pinkster holiday, right? The Hip Hop Museum and hip hop historians will tell you about breakdancing. That it started here in New York with, brothers spinning on the linoleum and things of that nature. Well, it actually goes back to the Pinkster holiday because they would put down blocks of wood and they would dance and they would spin on their backs, right? And the most popular dancer would be granted freedom at that time. So when you think about breakdancing, it didn't start here in the Bronx in the 70s or the 80s, but it actually goes back to the 1600s with the Pinkster holiday. And again, like I said, you can go to the White Coffin Museum. I think it's on Ralph and Clarendon, I think.
Oh, here in Brooklyn, right?
Yes, here in Brooklyn. And they will give you a lot of history on the Pinkster holiday and the Africans who first arrived here with the Dutch. And also they have a YouTube channel as well, so you can check out some of their videos on that. And in fact, before I continue with his story, let me just give you a brief history on Pinkster holiday. All these cues up.
It is actually when the Christ no longer, it was his last day on earth, gifted the apostles the Holy Spirit. They pushed the windows open in the upper room and spoke to people in Jerusalem in languages that each heard in their own tongue. So it is really the official beginning of the Christian church. And it is celebrated all over the world. But here in New York, because the Dutch were settlers here, it is their language, it's their take that we step out into the celebration of Easter, or Pentecost, and that's why it's called Easter. Over time, it takes on African traditions. It becomes a time of rest for the enslaved that they don't have any other time of year. So it's a very well documented and very special time for history. I always enjoy in the slave years because it's the joy of survival, it's the joy of connection, it's the joy of culture that I'm hoping will embrace.
For me, Easter is very significant because it is probably, well, it is definitely the oldest recurring celebration of African cultural heritage that people publicly celebrate, that people publicly engaged in. I would say on the continent of the United States, or what we know today as the continent of the United States, and it's so very important because so much of the conversation about enslavement is about African people being taken, being stolen, being brought here, their identities are being stripped from them, they're being assigned identities, names, and the underpinnings of culture and identity being disassembled. And here you have, for 200 years, you have people who are actually celebrating their heritage and their culture and their history, which predated their enslavement. So when we talk about what was taken away and what was forgotten, here you have people who are actually engaging publicly and proudly and celebratory
They also celebrated, excuse me, Hudson Valley. Excuse me, blacks in Hudson Valley celebrate the Pinkster holiday. And again, you can go to the White Coat Museum to find out more about that, or follow their social media. I think they're on Instagram and Twitter. I'm not too sure about Facebook, but you can check that out for yourself and find out. Now again, here is another early African here in New York. I'm going to start reading down here because I know we're coming up on a break. New York authorities held an investigation, and a servant girl named Mary Burton began to tell stories of the great slave conspiracy to burn down the town and kill white men. 70 blacks and 20 whites were arrested and charged. They were pressed to confess and blame others. Again, we read that in the previous story, but this all took place, and he was one who was gathered or caught, if you will, and tried for setting these fires and attempting to kill their slave owners. Looking at Sister Veronica and her skirt, you know, people don't even ask the question why the skirts are so wide, because they were allowed to hide weapons under them. Or even like when they were able to steal back their children, they would hide them under the skirts and keep them in the barns, because you got to think about New York ain't what it looks like now. It was mostly farmland, right? And so you could always hide something, and that's oftentimes what they did. So, you know, for the sisters out there who wear African garb or whatever, and you ever want to know why the skirts were always so wide or as wide as they are, is because they could hide things, in particular weapons. All right?
Like
So,
Boston.
say it again?
Like Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Many witnesses testified against Ward's will. Some said he was present in the taverns when the talk of burning down the towns took place, that he was there when they were sharpening the knives. All of this, to make it short, you know, he was captured and then he was sent to Antigua. Again, blacks here dreaded going to the Caribbean because that's where they were treated the harshest. Right? So this ADOS argument doesn't work. Yet again, because here's a man who was from here, then had to be shipped to Antigua. Does that mean that his family gives up his legacy here? I think not. Right? So that quashes that ADOS argument right then and there.
The Caribbean usually die within a 7-year span lifespan.
You ready, Ray?
No.
I think you heard that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, on our Zoom audience, we're going to have a 10-minute break. We got croissants and coffee to the side. If anybody from the Zoom audience wants to make a donation to the Mackey's group to help the group, it's Cash App Mackey at 104 if you want to support the group. Okay. I'll find out. But other than that, enjoy the croissants and everything, coffee and soup. We're going to have a 10-minute break. Okay, families, give yourself a big hand. I want to thank you for, I hope you enjoyed the festivities. Excuse me. Keisha's going to come back, and then she's going to do a question and answer after she finished. We're going to do one question from Zoom, one question from the floor. So we're going to give the lecture back to Keisha. Thank you very much, family. Yeah, Keisha.
Okay. Good to go?
Yeah, we're good.
Livingston's African Runway. On November 6, 1752, Philip Livingston. Livingston Street downtown?
Downtown Brooklyn.
Okay, was he owned by the Livingston family? Legacy? Where's the legacy at? Okay?
I don't see nothing down there.
Okay. Philip Livingston placed a notice in the New York Gazette. He wanted readers to know that his new slave had run away. Many owners placed newspaper ads like this because many slaves ran away. But this black man was unusual. He had just arrived from Africa and did not yet have a slave name. Livingston said that the runaway's hair was curled in a very remarkable manner. Maybe this was an African hairstyle, and maybe he came from a different part of Africa from most slaves. Livingston thought his unusual hair would help people identify the man. In the decade since the 1741 revolt, New York slave owners had tried to buy most of their slaves directly from Africa. They believed newly arrived Africans would be easier to handle, more frightened and isolated, and less likely to rebel than slaves who had been in the colonies for a while. Livingston's runaway had just arrived in New York and had not yet learned English or Dutch. He spoke only his African language. There were many African-born slaves in New York, and they spoke many different languages, depending on where they had been born. If the runaway tried to ask other blacks for help, he might not have been understood, though his meaning would certainly have been clear. The African had been gone for a week when the notice appeared. Livingston thought he was hiding in the woods in Harlem, which was still a dense forest then. The runaway could have found streams to drink from and animals to trap. If he was looking for a way off Manhattan Island, there was a small bridge in Spurton Diver. He could have tried to steal a boat and cross the river at night under the cover of darkness. It was November and much too cold to swim to the Bronx. No one knows what happened to this runaway. He was brave and independent, and the notice said he was strong. But Livingston set a high reward for his return. Because of this, many people were probably in the Harlem woods, trying to catch a black man with remarkable curls. This is what Livingston hoped for, and it is why he placed the notice. Philip Livingston, the runaway's owner, was a rich merchant and ship owner. His father was involved in the slave trade, and Philip owned many slaves himself. Over the next 25 years, though, this slave owner will become involved in the American Revolution. He was one of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Many white people at the time lived with contradictions like this. So, here you have a brother who was brought here from the continent of Africa, became rebellious out the gate, owned by the Livingston family. Livingston Street is downtown Brooklyn. Does his descendants not have claim to legacy? Here in New York? Charles Roberts. Roberts was a man of many skills. He could read and write. He played the fiddle. He knew arithmetic and could keep account books. Maybe most importantly, he knew how to operate the printing presses that belonged to John Holt. He was Holt's indentured servant, and he had 3 years left on his contract. Roberts wanted his freedom sooner. He played his fiddle to make money so he could pay Holt for the remaining time. Some people said that Holt was not an honest man. They said he lied, drank, and refused to pay his debts. When Holt blamed Charles Roberts and a slave named George for a robbery, not everyone believed him. Charles Roberts and George were put in jail anyway. They ran away, but they were caught and brought back to stand trial. Roberts was found guilty. He was beaten, and his length of service was changed from 3 years to 40 years. He was about 30 then. He would be John Holt's servant until he was an old man, if he lived that long. It was like being a slave. On April 12, 1762, Charles Roberts ran away again. It was about the time his original contract would have ended. Holt was furious. He placed a very long notice in Parker's New York Gazette. He described Roberts in great detail. He said Roberts was a mulatto, meaning a light-skinned black. He listed his height and age, the fact that he had smallpox, and that he had played the fiddle. He described all of the clothes Roberts had with him. There was a chocolate-colored cloth coat, a high blue-gray summer coat, a straw-colored waistcoat edged with a silver cord, and many other items. Holt said that he liked to dress very neat and gentile, and generally wears a wig. Holt's notice called Roberts cunning and said that he was not to be trusted. It said he was a criminal, maybe involved in recent robberies. Holt offered a very big reward, £5, and said people should be careful of Roberts, whom he called an artful villain. John Holt was desperate to get Roberts back. People said he could not run his printing business without him. The notice did not work. Roberts was never heard from again. He may have used his many skills to make a new life somewhere else. Now, in this story, he said that he dressed very genteel. Now that means that whatever clothes that he was given to him by his enslaver. They also said that he wore a wig. What was this enslaver doing to him? Was homosexuality at play here?
Yes, it was.
I don't know. I'm just saying, looks suspect to me.
Yes.
Mulatto also means to pass for white.
I'm just saying.
Yes, it does.
Morehouse is Peg. Peg and her owner, Rebecca Morehouse, lived close to the shipyards in the East River, near where the Brooklyn Bridge is today. This waterfront area was full of shops and tradesmen. Morehouse may have made money sewing, cooking, or washing for ships, crews, and Peg may have helped her. Peg was born in Oyster Bay, Long Island. Again, there is legacy. So she spoke English well. She had been living in New York City for many years when she ran away on December 12, 1764. At that time, there were more female slaves in Manhattan than male. Enslaved women did not run away as often as men, maybe because they had fewer chances. Typical runaways were young men from farms and small towns. If they were lucky, they made it to New York, pretended to be free, and disappeared into the busy life of the city. Peg was an unusual runaway, a 40-year-old woman who lived in Manhattan. The notice gives no clue as to why Peg ran, but the typical reason was to join family members who had been sold to a distant owner. New York City slaves who decided to run had a special problem. They could not stay in the city because they might be recognized and turned in for a reward. Leaving the city without being caught was not easy, but Peg lived at the waterfront, where she had watched many ships come and go. She may have been waiting, for just the right moment to climb aboard and offer to cook in exchange for her passage to another place. She had to be careful which ship she picked and where it was going. Otherwise, there was a chance she would be sold again at the end of her trip. It might be worth a gamble, though, because sometimes ship captains said yes. Rebecca Morehouse was worried about this. When she placed the runaway ad the day after Peg had vanished, She added the common warning, all masters of vessels and others are forewarned not to entertain or carry her away, as they will answer it at their peril. She also worried that Peg might escape to the countryside, so she offered a reward of $1 if Peg was captured in the city and $3 if she was taken out of town. To make the runaway easier to identify, Morehouse noted that Peg had a crooked middle finger on her left hand, and that she had run off wearing a short red cloak, white cap, men's shoes. Peg also had a calico dress and other clothes with her, a sign that she had planned her escape. I told you, those wide skirts, you can hide a lot under them. She knew she would need a change of clothes because people would be looking for a red cloak and white cap. Rebecca Morehouse wanted Peg back, and the notice in New York City Gazette shows why. Peg was tall, slim, and straight. So she probably did not have arthritis, which can make people crippled and unable to walk hard. She had already had smallpox, so she would not come down with this disease again. The notice said that Peg was sensible, cunning, and artful, which probably meant that she was smart and had good common sense. She could wash, iron, and cook. Peg may have escaped. Even if she was caught and beaten, she had the satisfaction of knowing she caused her owner some trouble. She also cost her some money because slaves who had run away were worth less the next time they were sold. A good book you can read more about her is They Once Were Her Property. It's about white women who were slave owners. So her story is in that book as well. Brother Ty.
They once were who?
Oh, they once were her property. Very good book to have. Because it is not spoken of, but some of the most brutal slave masters were white women, especially as it related to black women. Very brutal towards black women, very brutal. When he was a slave in New Jersey, he was called Titus. He was 22 when the American Revolution began in the spring of 1775. A few months later, the British promised freedom in Virginia to any black person who fought on their side. Titus ran away the next day, one of hundreds of blacks from many places who went to fight for the British. His owner placed an ad in the Pennsylvania newspaper, offering a reward to anyone who returned Titus to him. No one caught this runaway, though. He joined the British Army and called himself Colonel Ty. With his name, he became famous. Some black people fought with patriots, but others thought that the British victory would be better for blacks. After the British promised freedom to the runaway slaves who joined the British side, many blacks escaped and arrived in New York City, the British headquarters. 24 of the best black soldiers belonged to the Black Brigade. Colonel Ty was their commander. Colonel Ty led his men on raids in New Jersey, where he had been a slave. They captured Patriot soldiers and destroyed houses and barns. Because Ty knew the area well, the men could hide in swamps and riverbanks and strike suddenly. The raids terrified the local patriots, but slaves heard about Colonel Ty's attacks and felt encouraged. Many more fled to the British. By 1779, there were 3,000 black people in New York City, maybe more. They had come from all over the country. Some black men became soldiers and lived in one of the city's Negro barracks. Others, along with women and children, lived in tents in a partly burned out neighborhood called Canvas Town. New York suffered a hard and cold winter in 1779. Food and fuel were scarce. Colonel Ty's Black Brigade joined with the Queen's Rangers, a small unit of white soldiers, and together they raided the Patriot areas of New Jersey. They brought fuel, livestock, and other supplies back to New York City. They also guarded the ferry landings along the North River, later called the Hudson. The ferries regularly brought more escaped slaves across from New Jersey. Colonel Ty continued fighting until September of 1780, when he was shot in the wrist during a surprise attack. The injury was not serious, but a fatal infection set inside and he died. He was considered a fine and brave soldier by the British and even by some of his Patriot enemies. Peggy Gwynn. During the American Revolution, the British were in control of New York City. When they offered freedom to any slave who would fight against the Patriots, many black people ran away from their owners and came to New York City to fight for the king. The men became soldiers or laborers in the British Army. Women like Peggy Gwynn were cooks and laundresses. They were slaves and free blacks. There were slaves and free blacks on the Patriot side too. Life was not easy. New York City was often under attack. There was not always enough food. Many of the blacks lived in makeshift tents in burnt out neighborhoods. Kind of sound like the Bronx. No shade, but whatever. But they were fairer than they had ever been. They were paid for their work. They could go to the tavern with friends, dance, and listen to fiddle music. If they met someone and fell in love, they could even marry in Trinity Church. This may be where Peggy Gwynn married her husband, who was fighting for the British. Trinity Church still own a lot of property here in New York, do they not?
Yes, they do.
After the British lost the war, their commander, Sir Guy Carleton, was determined to honor the British promise of freedom to the blacks. He would give them papers and granted their freedom, and he would transport them away from America for good.
That's right.
Slave owners around the country were furious. They were on the winning side, after all, and they were about to lose what they saw as their property. George Washington himself came to argue with Carleton about the slave. Carleton compromised and said he would only free blacks who could prove they had been in New York City before the first peace treaty of November 30th, 1782. This may have been a very important date for Peggy Gwynn. The freed blacks began leaving in the spring of 1783, most bound for Nova Scotia. At some point during the next week, Peggy Gwynn sent a request to General Carleton. She asked for her permission to go with her husband when he sailed. She said he was in the artillery. She said he had come to New York with the king's troops, but she did not say when. Peggy Gwynn also pointed out a problem. A certain Mr. Crammon wanted to detain her and deprive her of the liberty she had enjoyed. Peggy and her husband begged Carleton for help. Crammon may have believed he rightly owned Peggy Gwynn, and he may have come to New York to argue his case. Many slave owners did this. He may have petitioned Carleton and claimed that Peggy had to come to New York after the critical date, November 30th, 1782. Whatever arguments Carleton heard, he did not grant Peggy's wish. She was turned over to Crammon in a life of slavery. Her husband sailed without her. Deborah Squash. Deborah was a girl When Deborah was a girl, she was a slave on a big plantation in Virginia. Her owner was none other than General George Washington. She may have worked in the house or in the fields, but either way she worked hard. The general thought everyone, male and female, slave and free, should work as hard and as long as his or her strength would allow. Slaves often ran away from Washington's plantation. Some were caught in a few days. Deborah was one of the ones who managed to escape. She was 16 when she ran away. It was 1779, and the general was leading the Patriot Army in the Revolutionary War when she ran. Deborah probably looked for the general's enemies to protect her. The British had often offered freedom to black people who would help them. Many slaves ran away from their owners to fight for the king. 4 years later, Deborah was among the more than 3,000 blacks in New York City, headquarters of the British Army. She was married by then. She and her husband, Harvey Squash, were both about 20 years old. They were both strong and healthy, and they were both still caught in slavery. Deborah remained the legal property of George Washington, and her husband was still a slave. He belonged to a man named Lynch, who had bought him from the British officer. Deborah and her husband prayed for the British victory and freedom. The British lost though. General Washington and other slaveholders were on the winning side, and they wanted their property back. The British said no. Their general, Sir Guy Carleton, insisted on keeping the promise he made to the blacks who had joined the British cause. He wanted to give each black person an official certificate of freedom. He also wanted to help them escape to other countries so they wouldn't become slaves again. In May of 1783, General Washington asked for a meeting with General Carleton. They met as gentlemen. In a quiet voice, Washington asked Carleton to return everything that belonged to the American victors, including the Negroes. Carleton answered that he meant to honor his promise and that some of the blacks had already left the New York harbor. Already left? Washington was shocked. He was even more shocked later when he learned that Deborah Squash was on one of those first ships and long gone. She and her husband were bound for a town in Port Roseway, Nova Scotia, Canada.
You ready for question and answer?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, give Keisha a big hand. Now we're going to go for the Zoom audience. We're going to have a question and answer. If anybody, the Zoom audience is going to go first. If anybody from the Zoom audience wants to ask Keisha a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Zoom audience, number one, anybody got a question to ask Keisha? Unmute yourself, anybody from the Zoom audience that wants to ask Keisha a question, unmute yourself and you can ask the question right now. Okay, so we got nobody from the Zoom asking a question. Does anybody from the audience want to ask Keisha a question? Go ahead, my brother.
Appreciate this information, sis. I agree with you 3,000%. We always talk about the Egypt, the Africas, a lot of places, but a lot of history right here where we at, right in America, right in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the museum, that's a library or a museum on Ralph McClary Road?
It's a museum. It's called the White Coffin Museum.
White Coffin.
And most of the displays or things that they have in it are about the Dutch.
Okay.
Right? So they include that Pinkster holiday. They also have something about some of the people that I read about here tonight who were first brought over here by the Dutch. So it's a lot of information in there. And again, I believe they have the reenactment of the Pinkster celebration. I believe it's May, but you can double check that, but I think it's May.
Right, because the first time I heard about Pinkster holiday and celebrations was, Brother Basim Chowie on WBAI, Education at the Crossroads. He's
Okay.
been talking about it for years, and he talks about it every year. Now,
Okay.
this sister you just dealt with,
Mm-hmm.
I know there was a book called Never Caught, and this was another sister. I don't know if she's the same.
No, that's not her.
That's not her. No,
No.
different. Okay, that's another one who was enslaved by George Washington.
Yeah, the one you're talking about is the one that George Washington actually put out warrant for her arrest and was seeking friends well, I won't go into that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I should let Keisha answer, I'm sorry. But that's not the one.
Okay.
And it got real big, and she was spotted years later, and but go ahead. Yeah, but that's a good one though.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a whole book on her.
Yes, that's a very good
Never
book.
Caught.
I enjoyed that
Runway,
book.
Christmas Day.
Pink says before Juneteenth.
Yes, yes. In fact, when they talk about Pinkster holiday, they bring up Juneteenth. It was like, they always explain to you that we don't know the beginning of this and always waited for white folks. Oh, I just wanted to show y'all this real quick. This is in New York. This is New York. This is in the 1920s.
Is that in Coffin?
This is Lower Manhattan.
Oh, that's that building that's still there.
Yeah.
Like 23rd around that.
It's 23rd Street and Fifth Avenue.
There is a
Because
brother
that clock
who-
and that building is still there now.
That's right.
who actually is a driver to a white family. Let's see if I can find him here. Here we go.
Fire building, right, Keisha? They had a fire in that building?
There he is. You see this brother, he's the driver
Oh, wow.
to this white family. This is 1920 in New York, right?
You got the cat.
What is his story and his legacy? So when people say, well, when the Irish and the rest of them cats talk about, well, we was here first, really? Really? Apparently they haven't read any books or been to any of their own museums.
Right.
Because it gives you the history, right? This comes from the New York archives. I pulled this from. I like to look at film like this because, first of all, I'm a fan of one of the greatest movie producers, film producers, is Oscar Micheaux. So
First one ever did.
I like to look at a lot of this. It gives you, there's a sister sitting at the bench over there, but it gives you a look, a glimpse of what it looked like when our ancestors was here, right? What they had to go through and, the train stations and all of that. And also, if you go to New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, there is a video here, and it talks about where blacks came from, where we resided. All of those red dots that you see in there is where black people resided in early New York, or when it was called New Amsterdam.
The information I'll present tonight is a general overview of an incredible.
So you guys can always check that out whenever you want to. If you follow me on social media, I will give you the links to these videos so that you can watch them in their entirety for yourselves. Whenever you want to, I even have a video of a brother who travels the world, really, doing virtual tours of our history. And this is one video that he did in Mexico.
A lot of runaway slaves made home.
Hold on.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Good, man.
Yeah, just want to distinguish. I think it's very important to understand that chattel slavery is chattel slavery. However, the Dutch had a whole different concept, from the British. Just want to point that out because when the British actually later took over New York, as it did with most of the entire East Coast, the slavery was more brutal. So in that sense, you could say that the Dutch was more humane, even though there's no
Right,
humanity in chattel slavery.
facts.
But I'm just saying that comparing the two, if you want to delineate between the two, you're talking about a situation where the Dutch had a system in place that did not strip you of your entire humanity. In other words, they made room for a black man having a black woman and sleeping with her at night, or just a form of having somewhat of a family, not total familyhood, but they gave you a more sense. You had a sense of family because you could cohabitate with your wife if they acknowledged that that was your wife. As with the British, there's no such thing as a marriage. Whether you jump over a broom for them or not, they did not acknowledge marriage, family, contracts, nothing. So I'm just saying in that sense, the Dutch were more humane, only in that sense. So don't attack me saying later, well, Michael said that the Dutch was all right. They're not all right. They devilish. It's just they were less devilish. Okay? So include that if you say something. Say Michael said they were less devilish, but they were all devilish. That's what I'm saying.
But see, brother, the reality is, hold on. But see, the reality is, bro, the lesser, the more, this one, they all devils, man.
I think I said that. I think I said that. I'm waiting to hear, because I know people. I know some of y'all. Y'all been waiting a long time for a gotcha moment. So you're not going to be able to get me on that one. You're going to have to wait a while. I know our folks. See, I don't just study white folks. I study our people too. So you ain't gonna have a gotcha with me and say later, well, didn't you say one time the Dutch were all right? I ain't said none of the devils were all right. They all devils. However, the British were more devilish. So put the ISA. There's levels of devils. And they're all devils now, don't get me wrong. Y'all don't want to think y'all got white friends. You ain't never heard me say I got white friends. All right, let's get it right.
Okay, any other? Go ahead, Doc.
Go ahead, Doc.
Should we, as African people, wherever we are, but specifically if we have a discussion about in the United States, should we consider, for everyone's consideration, but it's directed to you because you presented and you've given us background of what happened to us here. Should we consider the United States Constitution as a slave code document, considering that the individuals who put together and made the Constitution of the United States were all white male slave owners, and that the Constitution reflects essentially the same principles and documents that every one of the 13 colonies slave code documents have in place? That's the question.
Absolutely. There is no difference. There is no difference. If you look at the Constitution, what will we call? 3/5? That code, that in itself tells you the standing of the United States, the standing of those colonies. That in itself, that statement in itself gives you the blueprint for what they believe. White supremacy at all costs.
United States.
So as Mike said, it may seem like the Dutch were a bit humane than the British. We have to again remember who's telling the story, right? Because we're not telling the story.
Exactly.
They're telling the story. And that's why independent black media is so crucial right now.
Yes.
So that we tell our own stories from our own perspective.
Yeah, just want to point out with respect to Dr. Lewis' question. The question is legit, however, you always have to understand that the British was fighting America's founding fathers.
Correct.
Understand that. Now, she made the presentation, but you have to understand what line of questioning and what's not being mentioned in this. If they are fighting America's founding fathers, and American founding fathers said we are subhumans, they made that crystal clear. Calling you 3/5 of a human being, that's the relegation that you're higher than a cow, you might be higher than a monkey, but that's about it. You're not human. But you're better than a monkey or a cow, or something like that. So you're fighting, there's a battle going on between a set of white people where one is saying that one is accusing America, and America is accusing the British of interfering in their domestic policy, and how they're the queen, point out that to raise up and offer black people freedom, you're creating a problem between the colonies. So they had to fight, because how can you offer freedom? They wasn't bringing them back to Britain. They was going to take you to Canada. So every black person in America should have took the offer. Because why would I want to stay here where my future is slavery? At least they're offering to take us someplace where we can be free and independent, possibly. So, every black person. So, I'm just asking questions y'all should ask, because you should have said what happened to those black people that got on the boats. They went to Nova Scotia and they had a relatively freedom, even though you met some devils up there, the French up there. So, yeah, you were free, you weren't subordinate to them, but they didn't open up their system to you either, but at least you had a level of freedom. So I'm just pointing that out. What Dr. Lewis asked is a battle between two devils. And both of them, even on their documentation, made it crystal clear, you're not a human being.
Good, Doc.
Just
The devil is the devil.
Let's slip on a banana peel.
the thing that I want to emphasize is for us to go back to the Constitution of the United States, because we're here.
Right.
And for you to take any of the slave code documents, because all of the colonies have, use Virginia, that was the biggest.
Yeah.
You look at the slave code document as written, and you match it up to the Constitution of the United States, down to the fugitive law, down to how they designated you as 3/5 and the Indian here, and they even had a designation called infidels.
Right.
If you were a Moor, if you were Jewish, and you were from a Muslim, you were infidel. So what I'm saying is that just take those two. If you really want to look at the United States Constitution and what the United States stands for, Constitution of the United States, you take the slave code document of Virginia, you juxtaposition, you're going to find that there is no difference. The Constitution of the United States is a slave code document. Not only because of what it meant, and they brought it forth, but everyone who voted on it were all white, male, slaveholders. So that people have to understand that where the Constitution is. That's the point of it.
Any other question? One last one? One last question.
Before I went to the bathroom, I brought up this picture of this woman. I was telling my siblings, two of my siblings, I like to take road trips, by myself. Just get in my bag and go. But anyway, I was saying that I wanted to take a road trip to Wyoming. And so one of my sisters, my youngest sister, said, why the hell would you want to go to Wyoming? There's like 3 black people here. So I said, well, that may be in certain towns of Wyoming. I said, but we cannot easily relinquish what we pioneered and established, right? And so when you look at some of the first pioneers of Colorado and Cheyenne, Wyoming, you come across this woman, who people call, the historical records call her Aunt Clara Brown. isn't it? Oh, I'm sorry. Aunt Clara Brown. And she was one of the first pioneers or settlers of Colorado. Now, she didn't get her freedom until she was in her 60s, right? When she got her freedom, that was the beginning of the gold rush, right? So a lot of white men were moving out west, or heading out west for the gold rush. And she had asked these white men if she could accompany them. And they said, yeah, you wash our dirty drawers and cook for us and so on and so forth, we'll let you come. So she said, okay, she did that. But while they were mining gold, right, on their clothing was a lot of gold dust. And so she put a pan under the washboard when she was washing their clothes and collected all of that gold dust. And because she had a friend who could smelt, he would, you know, make cubes and bowls for her. And that's how she attained her wealth. Now, in Wyoming and in Colorado, the Museum of Cheyenne, Wyoming, they have a display of her in there. She owned restaurants, hotels, restaurants, we call them 24-hour slots now, right? You can get a hamburger for 24 hours any day. I think that's White Castle or something, right? So if she was the first White Castle, who does that legacy belong to? So I'm just saying, you know, don't be afraid to venture out to different places, because believe it or not, when you look at the history, a lot of us was there in the beginning. And I'm talking about various states in this union, not just the ones that they claim to only have slave labor in, but in others. And if we're not careful, when we present our argument for reparations, we won't know any of this, right? Somebody will tell you, let's say, I don't know, I'm a judge and I'm saying you have no legacy here. You can't prove nothing here. Well, if you don't know your local history, you can't bring that into a courtroom, right? When you look at some of the people who are arguing on behalf of reparations, they never talk about the local history, because that calls into question these people's lineage, the property that they owned, the towns that they settled. You know, Washington Square Park is Washington Square Park. But as of today, you know that to be land of the blacks, right? Because I gave you that history and that information. So we can't claim our legacy here. And then what happened to that property? How did the state get in control of it? When did it happen? Who were these families that controlled it? And next time I come back, I'll talk about these families. Like I said in the beginning, one of the most powerful slave-owned families in New York was Vanderbilts. Right? The Vanderbilts, they live up in Dutchess County now. You got Vanderbilt Avenue, downtown Brooklyn. I mean, where does all of this come from? Right? So we can't claim our legacy. We can't claim what's rightfully ours. And if we don't, you're going to have these type of problems where you've got mulattoes, because that's what they are, the Mexicans are. They identify as white, and they coming over here, and they getting $450,000 because the mothers were separated from the children. Some of us today, if I poll each and every one of y'all in here today, can you tell me where your oldest ancestor came from? Where did they settle? So we were separated from ours too. But the Congressional Black Caucus will tell us that we have to commission a study. They've been commissioning a study since 1984 when John Conyers brought that up.
Absolutely. That's correct. Right. 84.
Now that he's gone, you got Sheila Jackson Lee, and she too talking about a study. But everybody else is getting bread. And you have black people who say, well, we don't need reparations. You can't do a goddamn thing without money. And I'm not willing to relinquish what rightfully belongs to us. So I hope after today you have a different mindset about where you live, the streets that you travel. When you ride on the subway and it's passing various stops, remember that our people settled that area, or settled these areas. And it rightfully belongs to us.
Black Graves Matter. The Vanderbilts own the church right on Church in Flatbush. So they've had, I want to say I became aware of it because of DAI this April. So they have been having rallies there. No black person is allowed in that graveyard to this day, that church there. Mind you, at Erasmus, which is one block over, that's the black grave that's unkept and all this other stuff. And, you know, I don't know if y'all saw the Tribunal 2021 with activists from around the world and the Panthers and so forth, where they're discussing, you know, they had some folks from BAI who, you know, don't give a damn about us. So they playing both sides. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please give Sister Keisha a great big hand. We'll be back in part 2, but I'm gonna give a quick announcement. Thank you, Zoom audience. On November the 10th, Ya Santiwa is giving a bus ride to the Southampton, Virginia 191st anniversary in commemoration and celebration of Nat Turner. If anybody is interested, her number is 929-4624-4142. This is going to be on November 10th. It's going to be an overnight trip, so if you're looking to go, you can take that number and you can see Sister Gilbo over there. You can take her number and find out what's going on. Also, next 2 weeks, and 2 weeks from now will be what date?
The 17th.
On the 17th, we're going to bring in somebody that wants to support the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.
October 17th. November 17th.
November 17th, we have an out-of-town speaker that wants to support the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club. Brother Irritated Genie will be here on the 17th. Tell a friend. We're going to start maybe about 7. Who wants to come up and support Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club.
Live effect.
Irritated Genie will be here, and then after that we will tell you, probably bring back Keisha for part 2, but the Genie will be here. Everybody give Sister Keisha a great big hand. Family,